I'm pretty sure if you were to look down at your hands right now, you'd all come to the same conclusion. Unless some person who's watching this has synodactyl, you probably don't have webbed fingers. But did you know that you originally developed in the womb with webbed fingers? So, what happened to the webbing? They died. How do cells die, you ask? Even if you didn't ask, you're going to find out. First, we're going to start with apoptosis, which took me 5 minutes to learn how to pronounce. Apoptosis is programmed cell death, cellular suicide if you will, and contributes to the fact that you don't have webbed fingers and toes. Its opposite, necrosis, is unprogrammed cell death that occurs because something went wrong, like injuries or toxins. Apoptosis is meticulous and well-planned, something I wish I could say about my life. But for a good reason, because mistakes in apoptosis could lead to necrosis in cells that aren't supposed to die. The fate of the cells are in their hands. In apoptosis, the cell starts to shrink, and their genetic material condenses, clumps together, and the nucleus starts to break up as well. Then, blebbing occurs. That's when the cell membrane bulges to hold bits and pieces of the cell, and the cell breaks apart. And yes, the process is called blebbing. Scientists must have been tired of all the Greek stuff that takes 5 minutes to learn how to pronounce. So, these blebs are quickly eaten by phagocytes, cells in your immune system, which is the system that prevents diseases. And those phagocytes perform endocytosis, which is basically when the cell engulfs the blebs. If they're not eaten quickly, they go through necrosis. There are 2 pathways for apoptosis, the red pill or the blue pill. No. Actually, the 2 pathways are the intrinsic pathway and the extrinsic pathway. The intrinsic pathway is enacted if there is an internal reason. It's enacted by the mitochondria, which isn't just the powerhouse of the cell. The extrinsic path was if there's an external reason. Both pathways use these things called capsases, which are enzymes that break down proteins. In apoptosis, the cell still has a lot of control over itself in the initial stages. Also, it usually doesn't affect too many cells at once. Like I said, it's planned out. In fact, apoptosis is actually really predictable. For example, in a certain worm, C. elegans, 131,131,131 of the exact same cells die due to apoptosis as the worm develops. In any case, adults lose around 50 to 70 billion cells because of apoptosis, while children lose 20 to 30 billion. This may sound alarming, but as I said earlier, apoptosis is incredibly important. Apart from developing features in the embryo, they also help the health of the body. Because consider that after an infection, you'd have lots of immune cells that you don't need anymore. Apoptosis takes care of that. If cells grow too old, they're more likely to mutate, so apoptosis kicks in at a certain age for certain cells. It prevents cancer from occurring too. If signs of cancer are noticed in a cell, the cell goes through apoptosis unless those pathways to go through apoptosis are blocked. That's actually a method of cancer treatment, to try and get the cancer cell to undergo apoptosis. And it ensures our immune system is healthy. When immune cells are produced, they're tested to see if they react to harm any of the body's cells. If they do, apoptosis gets rid of them. If apoptosis fails, they're released, and they can attack tissue and cause problems. Speaking of attacking tissue, now we'll be discussing necrosis. Necrosis means death, the stage of dying, the act of killing in Greek, which is fitting and kind of epic name for unplanned cell death, where cells die because of things like injury, disease, toxins, trauma, and more. Necrosis doesn't have those neat pathways. It's messy and imperfect, triggering receptors swelling the cell until it bursts. These receptors unshape the cell membrane and release the contents of the cell. No blebs, no neatness. This leads to inflammation. The inflammation attracts immune cells, such as leukocytes and phagocytes, the latter that get rid of the broken cell. Leukocytes, in getting rid of the dead cells, also create collateral damage to non-necrotic tissue. Even if that isn't the case, necrosis could also be because of a cancer cell that escaped apoptosis and is now harming the cells around it because of its uncontrollable growth, killing many cells before it can be treated, if that's even possible at that point. Anyways, If necrotic cells build up, they have to be removed by surgery called debridement. So in the end, every cell eventually dies, but for different reasons. From the neat apoptosis to the messy necrosis, through getting rid of risky, old, cancerous, or useless cells, both function to preserve life through death.